Well, thank you, Senator. Really appreciate it. Obviously, we kind of told the members already that you couldn't be here today given the budget situation, so we appreciate you making this work at the last minute. I just want to start, obviously, with the breaking news this morning, Senator Feinstein's death. I'm wondering, if you saw her yesterday, if you had any kind of inclination that this was going to happen, and then if you wanted to say a few words about her legacy, obviously, just a Senate powerhouse.
She was a Senate powerhouse. She was an American powerhouse. If you have a chance today, I would encourage any of you to read Dianne Feinstein's Wikipedia entry. I've read it before, not today, but it goes on and on and on because she was the first in so many important fights, and she was one of the obviously great trailblazers among politicians in the modern history of our country. And her work in San Francisco was extraordinary, the challenges that she faced there. And then I got to know her in the Senate when we worked together on the comprehensive immigration reform in 2013, which tragically never passed the House, but she and I and Orrin Hatch and Marco Rubio negotiated the agriculture provisions there. And then when I went to the Special Committee on Intelligence, Dianne was there leading the fight on the Russian invasion of social media in 2016, making sure that report got done, and that there, I would say there is not a single person on that committee that took their oversight responsibilities more seriously than she did, and so. An amazing model for all of us, and a loss for all of us, and we're all going to miss her here.
Did you see her at all yesterday? Obviously
I did not see her yesterday. I have been worried for some time that I felt like if anybody deserved to be retired and sitting under a tree drinking wine in Northern California, it was Dianne Feinstein. She had the last couple years were really, really tough for her here, and she lost her husband a year ago, but she continued to show up to vote until the very end. I did not see her yesterday. No.
All right. Obviously, this is fresh news, but there's already been kind of a mad dash for her seat. People were running in 2024. Have you thought at all? I don't know if you've weighed in on that Senate primary in California yet, and obviously Gavin Newsom's going to have a tough decision here to make. Do you have a preference? Have you thought about?
I think I'll let the governor in California make his decision. I'm sure he's getting enough advice. He doesn't need anybody from Colorado telling him what to do, and I wouldn't know what he should do.
That's fair. And then I guess the last question on this front, but kind of a segue into my next line of questions. Does this change the calculus at all for the votes that you guys need to get a budget bill passed? Obviously, having one less Democrat in the Senate, such a narrow majority right now that you have, does this change the calculus? What is the Senate Democratic Caucus talking about this morning in terms of how this changes everything?
Well, we haven't gotten together yet. I'm sure we will later today. But it is interesting, Jesse. With respect to the budget, this is actually a moment where we've had a vote of almost 80 votes in the U.S. Senate to pass a budget to keep the government open. Very few things get 80 votes in the Senate these days, but there are obviously senators from all over the country, Republicans and Democrats, who believe that the American people do not want the government to shut down. So Dianne's vote is going to be important, probably on a lot of things, but not on that. Where we've got what we do need is for the House of Representatives to pass what the Senate has passed so that we can keep the government open. I am a little worried, Jesse, about whether or not there's going to be a Republican effort to try to stop her seat from being filled on the Judiciary Committee as sort of scorched earth politics to prevent any more judges from being confirmed. And I hope they don't try to do that.
Right, and for those who aren't following, obviously, Senator Feinstein's absence on the Judiciary Committee for a few months was a big problem in terms of getting judges confirmed. So that's definitely a consideration to think of. So I think probably in the next hours and days, we'll figure out kind of what the full consequences are and how fast Governor Newsom can make an appointment. Talking about the shutdown, one of the things that I find so interesting is it seems like Ukraine aid to Ukraine may be collateral in the negotiations to kind of get Congress out of this funding mess, at least in the short term. I wonder, if that's acceptable to you. I keep reading that the Senate Democrats are putting forward a package that has limited or no funding for Ukraine, and I wonder, if you have a sense of what the real world implications are if Ukraine funding or Ukraine aid is cut off, even just temporarily.
I think it would be a disaster, and we shouldn't do it. When you consider, I've had this conversation, by the way, with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and with Democrats and Republicans in the Senate. When you consider what has been accomplished by the Ukrainian people over the last 2 years, it is staggering, and nobody would have predicted it. I mean, the predictions were that Kyiv was going to fall in 72 hours, that Putin was going to dislodge Zelensky and set up his own puppet government. I mean, it was very clear that the Ukrainian people were going to fight forever, and our intelligence community was correct that they would never give up, that they would be relentless, that they would outlive Vladimir Putin. Literally, that's the kind of stuff they were saying. But to have, after 2 years of this battle, essentially a stalemate, to have the weakness of of Putin's army revealed for the world to see, to have the Ukrainian armed forces in, spitting distance, if you forgive me, of Crimea, to have the United States lead the entire free world in the support of Ukraine, democracies all over the world where people like my constituents have largely demanded of their elected representatives, do more, do more, do more, because we're inspired by the bravery of the Ukrainian people, and we know the Ukrainian people are standing up not just for Ukraine, but for democracy. The stakes could not be higher. And I can tell you, Xi Jinping is having to look again and again and again at his plans for Taiwan as a result of the way Ukraine has resisted this, tyrant's invasion with the support of the rest of the world. And yeah, we've spent $76 billion or so. That's not nothing. That's a significant amount of money, and it's going to cost a little bit more. But that's less money than Europe has been willing for once to pony up in an effort like this. The consolidation of NATO and of Europe behind the United States leadership here is, I think, incredibly welcome after we had a president who was saying that NATO wasn't worth anything and that the European alliance wasn't worth anything. So I think that if we cut and run here, it's going to be very likely that that's what's going to happen to the Europeans. And what President Zelensky said to us when he came to visit us not that long ago in the Senate a couple weeks ago was that they could only win this war with our help and that they'd lose the war without our help. The least we can do, I think, is support the courage that the Ukrainian people have shown, because for them, it's not about $72 billion, it's about their lives, which they've sacrificed, at least 100,000 Ukrainians.
Did you meet with President Zelensky individually or with a group of senators when he visited?
No. He came to speak in the old Senate chamber to the Senate, to Democrats and Republicans.
Okay.
It was an amazing, if I could just say, I sat there just like, everybody else, and what I was thinking to myself was, everybody in this room, notwithstanding what some of these people might think about themselves, everybody in this room is just a human being, including Zelensky. And here this guy who was, until 2 years ago or 3 years ago, was a television actor in his home country, and then became president of the country, and then a tyrant invades his country, and the entire weight of the world is dropped on this human being, and it's just an amazing thing to watch somebody rise to that occasion without training, without preparation, without a lifetime of thinking about, that this might come, and to lead the people, I think, through the inspiration of, the example that he set, and to be led by his own people's example. Anyway, I'm sorry to digress, but it was one of those moments, I think, when you just think, man, what we do as human beings, whether we're senators or teachers or farmers or ranchers or parents, actually counts for something. Hopefully it counts for something.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And let me just ask one last question on Ukraine. Obviously, there was the vote in the House last night, and I think half of the Republican conference voted against sending $300 million more, which is kind of a drop in the bucket when you consider the overall funding that we've provided to the Ukrainians. I wonder if there's a point where this becomes unpopular. Like, how much longer can Congress continue to send money? You know, is it a year? Is it 5 years?
Yeah.
Does it matter if who's in control? What's your crystal ball say on that?
Sure, I don't have a crystal ball, and certainly it could become unpopular. I mean, that certainly is what Putin is counting on. Putin had, I'm on the Intel committee, as maybe I mentioned, and he has made mistake after mistake after mistake leading up to this war, miscalculation after miscalculation. We could talk about that if you're interested. But one thing he's counting on is that we're going to get tired. One thing he's counting on is that Europe is going to get tired, because he knows if we are tired, and he's right next door, that he can take Ukraine. He knows that if we're tired, maybe Poland is next. And by the way, his time frame is not 10 minutes from now or one election cycle from now. His time frame is the rest of his life, or the hundreds of years that have elapsed since Peter the Great within the job that he's in today. And that's what he's counting on. That doesn't mean that we should have an unlimited commitment. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't review it every single day, what we're doing in Ukraine. We should be. But I think this is a moment that's much too early for us to back away. And I think if we do, the costs will be enormous in terms of what Putin will do in Ukraine and what Xi will do in Taiwan.
Well, let's kind of stay on the international relations front here, because I think your position on the Senate Intelligence Committee is one of the most important functions that you have in the Senate. And I wonder, what keeps you up at night? You mentioned Xi Jinping and China. Obviously, we talked about Ukraine and Russia. But anything in particular that we haven't talked about that really, you have access to classified information that the folks in this room don't. So I wonder, what's keeping you up?
Yeah, I would say broadly speaking, the 50 years of outsourcing to Southeast Asia and to China, I think, turns out to have been a really lousy set of policies that our country has pursued. And we have the chance now to onshore those supply chains, to reshore them or to nearshore them. I think it'd be very important for us to build a much closer relationship with Mexico and Canada and with all the other countries in our hemisphere, to be able to have the chance to compete effectively with Beijing, which I think we can do. We're more innovative. We have the rule of law. We have a democracy. There are a lot of reasons for us to think that we're going to be able to compete effectively. But I think it's important for us to join with these other countries to be able to have the mass. I don't mean literally join, but collaborate with, cooperate with, so that we've got the kind of markets that can be competitive and can offer to democracies around the world a vision that looks different than Xi Jinping's vision. Obviously, we've already talked about Ukraine, so I won't go back there. But our ability to stand and continue to support them is going to, I think, deny Putin and totalitarianism, frankly, for that matter, what they believed 2 years ago would be a massive victory for them. And as somebody who was deeply worried about the state of democracy just 2 years ago, for me to see people all over the free world standing up against us, I mean, that's a huge positive for the United States. I think that we've got to strengthen our alliances and our economic relationships with the free world. There's no desire by almost anybody in this world to be dominated in the unipolar world by China, but we got to show up and we got to not be hostile, and we have to be willing to integrate our markets in a better way. I would say I'm worried about future pandemics. I'm worried about the fact that the United States has a broken immigration system that is not orderly, doesn't comply with the rule of law, and doesn't honor our tradition as a nation of immigrants. We need to fix that. And by the way, there are a bunch of things as a country we need to take care of. Healthcare is still a headwind in America. The fact that we've got massive income inequality is a headwind. Our education system is a headwind. These are things that don't depend on China getting their act together. They depend on our getting our act together so that we can offer a compelling vision to humanity that's different than the one Xi Jinping is offered. And I guess I look at this as, I look at this as the work that we have to do together over the rest of our lifetimes to put the United States in a position where we've got something that we're proud to hand off to our kids and to our grandkids.
It's such an interesting conversation about the economic intricacies between the U.S. and China, right? Everyone talks about kind of the animosity, but I've always wondered what happens if we go to war. And I guess along those lines, there's been a lot of focus on what Joe Biden has to say about what would happen if China invades Taiwan. But obviously, Congress would probably have to declare an act of war, or at least that's how it's supposed to go. I wonder, if China should invade Taiwan, how do you think the U.S. should respond?
Well, let me say first that we do not want to be at war with China. That would be a disaster for the world, and it would be a disaster for us. We do not want a third world war, and we should do everything we can to avoid that. And I'm not going to speculate about what we're going to do if Xi Jinping invades Taiwan, but I will say that we should do everything we can do to make that possibility seem as unappealing, as unattractive as it possibly could be for Xi. And I think we can help do that.
All right. Moving on to some other topics, I wanted to ask you about, the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure bill. You and Senator Hickenlooper talked so much about the climate goals that were set out in those two pieces of legislation and, how they would be transformative, but we're about a year out from those being passed. And I kind of wonder, if we're at an inflection point, if there are things that you think are going especially well, if there are parts of that bill that aren't functioning the way that you would have, those bills that aren't functioning the way that you would have hoped.
Yeah. That was the IRA and the infrastructure bill? Were those the two that you mentioned?
Yes.
Yeah, I would add one. So I think there are three that I'd like to talk about together. One is infrastructure, one is the IRA, and one is the CHIPS Act, which was the semiconductor bill. And as you know, I just ran for re-election in Colorado, which is it always provides an amazing opportunity to try to understand what people have on their minds. And what I'll say, Jesse, is that I think that there was deep concern among Republicans, unaffiliated voters, and Democrats that all we could ever expect out of our exercise in self-government was chaos. They looked at the Trump, whatever the chaos was, it happened to be Trump for those 4 years. They looked at that chaos and thought, my God, is this all we're going to get out of it? We're never going to get anything else. And when you look at the most significant bipartisan infrastructure bill since Eisenhower was president and the investments in Colorado and across the country, I'll come back to in a second. When you look at the semiconductor bill, which is the first time in my adult lifetime, the first time since Ronald Reagan was the president in the 80s and began that outsourcing to Southeast Asia and to China, that Congress in a bipartisan way said, you know what, we're going to bring an industry back here, the semiconductor industry, to the point that we were just having about Taiwan, recognizing that 90% or more than 90% of the most important semiconductors in our fighter jets, in our submarines, in our surface ships are manufactured 100 miles off the coast of mainland China. What could go wrong with that? And finally we said, we're going to bring it back. I hope we're going to bring other things back, as I said earlier, not just to the US, but to the Western Hemisphere as well. And then the third bill is the Inflation Reduction Act, which in addition to the important climate provisions, for the first time overcame pharma, big pharma, and said, we're going to negotiate drug price, that Medicare finally is going to be required to negotiate drug prices on behalf of the American people, cap drug prices at $2,000 for seniors, cap insulin at $35. And you look at those three bills and I think you say, wow, maybe we can do something other than just chaos. And in Colorado, when I see $350 million being spent on the South Platte River, $100 million being spent on Floyd Hill, $160 million that's finally going to complete the Arkansas Valley conduit so that farmers and ranchers on the southeastern plains of Colorado who were promised clean drinking water by Jack Kennedy in 1962 over the next 3 years are going to finally get it as a result of the investments that we're making. Not to mention the $832 million that is being spent in broadband because of a bill that I wrote on the western slope of Colorado with the Delta Montrose Electric Association to take away the subsidies that were being given to big telecom companies and instead invest $40 billion in American communities to be able to deliver broadband across the country. You begin to see not just that we're making investments, not just that we can work together to pass the legislation, but that we might ultimately be able to compete really effectively with Beijing. So we can't compete effectively with Beijing with a government that's shut down. We can't compete effectively with Beijing with partisanship that knows no end, with an incapable, an inability to ever come to a consensus or an agreement on anything. And I think for those first couple of years of this Biden administration, we were able to demonstrate to the world that we could actually lead, and including on climate, where still no other country in the world has passed something as comprehensive as what we've passed. And the Europeans actually are attacking us for being unfair to them from a trade perspective because of the incentives that we put in place for clean energy there. And for once, somebody's attacking us for getting ahead of them rather than falling behind, which I think is a good thing, not a bad thing.
And we have about 10 minutes left, so I just want to drill down on this a little bit more.
I apologize.
No worries. But I just to follow up on this question. I mean, I think when I talk to Coloradans or when you talk to state lawmakers, even they feel like some of those incentives were so complicated that the state had to come in and fill the gap, or try and streamline it and make it go faster. Are you guys just to that inflection point? Do you feel like these things are working the way they should, or is it going to take more time before we know if they're effective or not?
No, I think they are working the way they should. I mean, I'm glad there are ways that, if there are, that the state can help improve the work that we've done. I think that's fantastic. But, if you talk to people in the solar industry or the wind industry, the carbon capture folks, a lot of that leadership is coming from Colorado. They're pretty excited about the Inflation Reduction Act. The expansion that I saw recently that's planned for the old Vestas plant outside of Pueblo is staggering in its size, and that would never have happened without the investment of the Inflation Reduction Act. I think the entire country, look, we need to have a global transition on energy, and Putin's invasion of Ukraine demonstrates that, because you saw the immediate reaction to that was, that Germany started talking about, well, maybe we should turn nuclear back on. The UK started to, re-up its coal plants. And I think we're in the position, because we've got abundant fossil fuels already, we're in the position to help Europe stay in this fight with our exports of liquefied natural gas. But at the same time that we're doing that, and at the same time we're using that LNG to replace the really dirty Chinese coal that's being burned all over the world, we have the chance now with the IRA, I think, to lead the global transition. And over the next 25 years, I expect the U.S. to be in that leadership position. And I think our economy is going to be a lot stronger as a result. We're going to be a much, much more robust exporter of those technologies over that period of time than historically we've been.
All right, let me ask you kind of a few quick political questions. After your current term, you're going to be the longest serving senator from Colorado. And I wonder, if you ever think about retiring and how long you envision staying in the Senate. You're going to, be one of those people that's there, forever.
I guess I think if I can feel that I'm effective and that we're able to put points on the board for Colorado and for the West, that I'll stay as long as I feel like I'm able to do that, and I think I have been able to do that. And the work that I'm being able to do on the Intelligence Committee, on the Ag Committee, where that's the one committee I came on the first day I was in the Senate. I'm still on that committee 14 years later. That's mattered a lot, I think, to Colorado's farmers and ranchers and agriculture. Not that everybody always votes for me in those counties, but we've had an amazing partnership over the years that I want you to work on, where we developed the expanded child tax credit, which for a short term has cut childhood poverty in our country in half, my goal is to end childhood poverty in the United States, and we've led that fight from Colorado, just like we led the broadband fight that I talked about earlier in the Inflation Reduction Act, or in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So, but I'll keep you posted if I change my mind.
All right, you have my number. And I guess
I
along those
do.
lines,
I do.
I guess along those lines, do you ever envision running for president again someday? I know we're about to face an election, but if you want to run in 2028, obviously you got to lay the groundwork now.
I don't know. I think it to tell. I really that was thing to do. I enjoyed a lot about myself. I learned a lot about the country, but that's something I'm not thinking about today, and we'll have to see what the future holds.
Okay. Just a quick, since we've got a few minutes, does anyone have any super pressing questions? Do you mind if I continue with mine? All right, I'm gonna keep going while the microphone's coming up. I want to talk about you mentioned the child tax credit. Obviously, that's something, that's kind of the cornerstone of your policy agenda. You had the expansion for 1 year in 2021 thanks to the budget reconciliation process. Obviously, it wasn't extended. Republicans in the House don't even want to fund the government right now, so I wonder how you're going to try and push forward on this policy. And at some point, does it just become kind of a pipe dream, right? I mean, do you ever foresee that expansion happening again?
I definitely don't think it's a pipe dream. Mitt Romney had a version of the tax credit that was very much like mine. It wasn't exactly the same, but it was very similar. He's obviously now leaving. There are other senators like Todd Young from Indiana who have been talking about interest in the child tax credit. And we might even be able to have a negotiation later this year as we think about trying to extend some of the corporate tax cuts, something I don't want to have us do unless we also extend the child tax credit. So I think there's the opportunity to continue to debate it. I still believe, and I think the evidence at this point is very clear that this is the most significant domestic policy achievement we have had in generations. And I think in the richest country in the world, as I said, we should have as our goal ending childhood poverty. Having been a school superintendent in Denver and having spent a lot of time traveling rural Colorado, meeting kids that are living in poverty, it would seem to me that we would have a desire just for the country as a whole, for the nation as a whole, to end childhood poverty. But if that weren't enough, the folks that looked at what we were doing on the child tax credit from Columbia University said it would pay 8 times back what we were investing in it, because instead of dealing with the consequences of childhood poverty in worse education outcomes, worse healthcare outcomes, in prison and other kinds of things, you'd be mitigating the effects of, or you'd be ending it. So I think it's the right thing to do. I think it's appealing to Republicans, by the way, because it doesn't add another federal bureaucrat or federal agency to anything. It's just putting money in the hands of people that are working really hard in this country to try to support their kids and giving them a little extra breathing room at the end of the month to pay for the rent, or to pay for school clothes, or for just a little bit of food. And in an economy that's been as unfair as the one as we've had, as long as we have, it's an important thing for us to do. Obviously, my goal and my objective is, in the end, I think we need an economy that when it grows for everybody, not just the people at the very top. I think America has been strongest and most persuasive when we have stood for both freedom and for opportunity. And I believe we can still generate a capitalist system in America that can stand for opportunity. I think we can stand for freedom and stand for civil rights and provide an incredibly significant counterbalance to what Xi Jinping is going to offer the rest of the world. But we have to get our act together to do it. And passing something like the child tax credit would be a big step in the right direction.
Am I hearing you right that there's negotiations, a potential extension of the Trump tax cuts to make the expansion of the child tax credit?
That's in 2025. There's some different things this year that we might get into in terms of expensing the R&D tax credit, for example, which is something I support. But if we're actually going to extend that, I want to see us extend, an enhanced child tax credit. But in 2025, you're right, exactly right. there's going to be an expiration of the Trump tax cuts, 52% of which went to the top 5% of taxpayers at a moment in the country's history when we've had the worst income inequality that we've had since the 1920s. I think in 1920 or in 2025, there's going to be a real opportunity for us to have a negotiation about this. Jesse, as you know, when I ran for reelection, I was very clear about, my view that we should not, certainly not be borrowing money from our children to finance tax cuts for the top 5% of Americans, and that we should be extending the child tax credit. I think that message was heard loud and clear in Colorado, and I think that's a message Democrats should be taking forward across the country. We won non-college educated voters in Colorado by 4% last year, while the Democratic Party was losing them nationally by 13%. I think part of the reason for that is the economic message that we ran on.
And do you have time for one quick audience question, or do you have to go?
I'll take whatever you want.
All right.
I'm stuck here in a shutdown, man. I got nothing
Be careful.
to do.
I've got a whole list of questions. Can you just raise your hand if you have questions? Elliot has the microphone, if you can run it over to this gentleman here.
And by the way, I'll add one, Jesse, because every town hall I do in Colorado, I always say, any questions or any criticisms anybody has. So I'm willing to take not just questions, but criticisms or observations as well.
And I don't know if you can hear this question, Senator Bennet, so I'll repeat it. But if you hear it yourself, just say, I got it.
Hey, I wanted to circle back to the potential shutdown. I know since you in the Senate have passed I guess a continuing resolution version of that, can you talk a little bit about the process that might get a vote in the House? There seems to be enough Democrats and Republicans in the House that probably would be willing to go with this, and it's being stalled by Speaker's strong desire to remain Speaker. So,
right.
Yeah.
I heard that question loud and clear, and the process is basically whatever the Speaker decides he wants the process to be. The government, if we don't get our act together here, the government's going to shut down on Sunday evening. And so, and your diagnosis is exactly correct. If the Speaker put a bill, if he put the bill we've passed in the Senate on the floor, it would get broad Democratic and Republican support, which is not surprising to me because that's what it got. That's what, if he put it in the House, that's what we got in the Senate. And instead, he's allowing this handful of people to hold him hostage because, as you said, they are saying if you allow the House to work its will, we're going to depose you as Speaker. The last horrible, I mean, I've seen this movie before, but one really painful episode that I remember is when we passed that immigration bill in the Senate that Dianne Feinstein and I worked on together. It got 68 votes in the Senate, 11 million, pathway to citizenship for 11 million people, the most progressive DREAM Act ever passed, $40 billion of border security. That's massive, a massive amount. All the visa issues that ag and everything else, all of it dealt with, 68 votes. And John Boehner, whom I like, and I think is a good guy and tried his best as Speaker, but he couldn't find a way to put it on the floor for there to be a majority vote. He said later that was his biggest regret as a political leader, was that he hadn't put it on the floor. Paul Ryan had the same failure and then ultimately lost his speakership. And you kind of wonder, what's the point of being Speaker of the House if you can't do something, constructive and helpful? And I think McCarthy's got the same potential here. So, I mean, if I were McCarthy, I think what I'd be doing is considering putting a vote on the floor to get a majority saying I should continue to be Speaker. And then after that, and I wouldn't do this in secret. I'd say this is what I'm going to do, but I would say I'm going to establish the fact that I'm going to be Speaker and that you're not going to be able to find someone else to be the Speaker. And then we're going to put the Senate bill on the floor, some version of that, and we'll pass it with people voting their conscience and able to go home and explain to the American people what they did. I think he's putting himself and his caucus in a terrible position, which is they're going to have to go home and explain why they shut the government down, and no one in America wants this government shut down, or virtually nobody does.
Any other audience questions? What do you see the kind of outcome here as being, right? I mean, I think what's interesting is I don't really know what the Republican caucus in the House wants, so I don't know if they're negotiating with the Senate Democratic majority to get something through. But are there, olive branches that you guys are offering, whether it's funding in Ukraine, whether it's border funding? Are you putting things on the table to try and maybe appease?
I think we feel like we did our work for now, in the sense that, we had I forget, I'm sorry to be coy about it, I can't remember if it was 77 or 78 votes, and people came and went, and the vote kind of went back and forth, but it was almost 80 votes in the Senate. And that is a massive expression of bipartisan support, not just for keeping the government open, but for funding for Ukraine, for the emergency funding. I mean, there's funding in there for, the tragedy in Maui and other, and by the way, something that I care deeply about, I've been fighting hard for, is extending the pay for federal wildland firefighters. That's in there. And if Republicans in the Senate can vote for this, and a majority of his caucus can vote for this, why in the world? This is not an issue that I can solve or that the Senate can solve for McCarthy. He has to figure out how to solve it with the recalcitrant people in his district that are literally holding a gun to his head and saying, we're not going to allow you to be speaker. You'll remember the night that he became speaker, when they had 15 votes or 18 votes or whatever it was. He's running up to the back to negotiate with Congressman Getz and whoever else that he was negotiating. This is that world, that those are the embers that he laid in his attempt to become speaker to begin with. And now I think he's got to decide whether he's going to capitulate to these people or find a more statesman-like way through. You asked for me to predict what I think is going to happen. I never do that in these instances, because literally there's no way to know. It could be that these guys decide that they're doing such political damage to themselves that McCarthy's able to pay some extortion to the recalcitrant people that's different from a government shutdown, and therefore they decide they're going to vote with him to keep it open or vote with him to be speaker. I think that another possible outcome is that they close the government for 2 weeks and then they reopen the government, not gaining a negotiating point with the Senate or with the American people, but capitulating to the Senate and to the American people, which is exactly what happened during the Trump shutdown. I was here for that, when he after he said that Mexico was going to pay for the border wall, and he shut the government down to try to get his border wall funded. He failed to do that. He could not do that. We had a bipartisan vote to reopen the government, and he got nothing. 2013, 10 years ago, when Colorado was literally being flooded, I just went to and people in Colorado were mucking out their basements, helping their neighbors push their cars out, looking for loved ones that had gone missing, trying to keep their small businesses open. People were coming from around the world to help us do that. We were all saying at that time, we're mountain strong, we're mountain strong. We're going to build back better than we did. And we did. 10 years later, I just went to the celebration or the memorial or the marking of the 10-year anniversary in Lyons, and in other spots where these floodwaters came 10 years ago. And it's just a reminder, because back then, that's when Ted Cruz shut the government down, over the Affordable Care Act. And while people in Colorado were having the rain falling on them, literally rivers of mud washing through their communities, and they were working together shoulder to shoulder to build their communities, to make us more strong, to make us more resilient, and to build us back better, which they did and which they have in every single dimension. Glen Haven was the other place that I visited. Here we are again with Ted Cruz's playbook, trying to impose something on the American people that's not supported by a majority of the American people. That's not how a democracy is supposed to work.
All right. Well, thank you, Senator. I appreciate it. I appreciate you going over a little bit here for us, and good luck. I hope you're not trapped in that room for too long, but it might be a couple weeks.
Thank you, and thanks for letting me stick around. I apologize again for not being there, and
no, we understand it's not your doing.
well, thank you, and good luck with the rest of the program. I'll send you a couple questions for Hickenlooper, Jesse, later.
Sounds
if
good.
that's
Sounds
okay.
good. Sounds good.
I can't get them answered. And let me just say good luck to every single Colorado sports team this weekend.
All right.
We're going to need it.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Bye, guys.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us for the first session. In about 50 minutes, Hickenlooper will be joining us on this screen. Hopefully, Senator Bennet won't give him too many heads ups about what I'm going to ask. And thank you. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and stick around for the rest of the day. Hickenlooper at 11, and then 1:30 for Polis over at St. Cajetan's.